All right, by my watch, we're close enough, so let's get this going. I'm Matt Dunwoody. This is Nick Carr. We're IR consultants with Mandiant. We had a particularly challenging, kind of interesting engagement that we worked. So we decided to put this talk together in order to address some of those challenges, the ways that we responded to them, and some of the lessons that we learned along the way. So first, a little bit of background. This started the way a lot of these incidents do, with a phishing email. You can see there, it's not even a particularly targeted email, but it was good enough that somebody clicked on it. I think a few people clicked on it. The client attempted to investigate and remediate. They failed the remediation, and the attackers, which were the Russian group APT29, they didn't like that. They did not like that one bit. So this is one of our favorite attack groups. We've worked quite a number of incidents with them, in particular recently, and they're definitely one of the most interesting. I think our intel says that they are a proficient and professional attack group or something along those lines. I always like that, as is kind of delightfully understated. So we came in just to help our client resolve some of these issues. Meanwhile, the attacker is continuing to complete their objectives, which are to steal the email of targeted VIPs and to monitor the security team in order to keep track of our response and detection efforts. So at the end of the investigation, we had a 4-person Mandiant team on site. At the end of this, we had over 1,000 compromised systems. We had over 1,000 unique malware samples by hash, never reuse the same hash. We had over 1,000 unique C2 domains and IPs. Almost never reused C2 across malware samples. We identified over 50,000 email communications stolen. That's probably only a small fraction of what they actually took. And including all of their scripts and tools, we identified, I took a look in our sandbox where we kind of aggregate all this stuff. We had over 7,000 unique attacker files. So how'd they pull this off? Well, the fast pace of the intrusion, they were very stealthy. They had rapidly changing tactics, and they employed advanced attack techniques. And so these are the 4 points that we're going to kind of hit on here. The first one being the fast pace of the attacker activity. So after that first failed remediation attempt, the attacker started deploying their main backdoor to at least 10 systems per day, and especially when provoked. They also accessed hundreds of systems for recon and credential theft, and continued to deploy other stealthier backdoor families along with that those main backdoors. They removed tools and forensic artifacts as they went, and they continued to steal data every week. No matter what the client did to try to slow them down, their data theft efforts were never even hindered. So in order to respond to this, we really had to change the way that we looked at these systems. So in order to get through these 10 to 20 systems per day that were coming in and getting compromised, we couldn't do the kind of in-depth analysis that we would typically want to do on these sorts of compromised systems. So we went to a more abbreviated triage method, leveraging the known attacker TTP. So on the systems where they were just accessing and dropping back doors, which was the most common thing that they would do, we weren't going to the depth of analysis that we might otherwise. And we also developed some indicators to assist with that triage. So by the time we actually got to looking at a system, our sweeps would have shown us 90% of what happened on that box. And it's just a matter of closing out the remaining 10% and making sure that there's nothing on there that we haven't seen before, nothing unique. So there were a couple of things that we couldn't write great indicators for, which is like lateral movement, which I'll kind of get into that later as to why that was a challenge. Some of their pivoting, anything new tools, new backdoors, and signs of data theft, we obviously have to document all of that. And along with that, we also had to streamline our documentation. We couldn't write live response reports the way that we typically would. We couldn't even really make timelines. It was just too much data. So we basically compressed it down into these single blocks that we kept in our engagement tracking spreadsheet. Contained things like the malware and attacker tools in the system, persistence mechanism that was in use, periods of attacker activity and any significant timestamps, the source of the activity. And we also documented any new findings in a little bit more free form as far as new tools, techniques, or procedures, any signs of data theft. So the lesson learned from this is just to be willing to change normal practices and disregard official methodologies when they're not working. You have to be willing to be flexible to respond and do what you have to do to be successful. At the end of the day, that's what really matters, though it is obviously important to also document as you go. And make the most of outside help. So this is something we talked a little bit more about in the past, but didn't include as much this time. But we really reached out to the client in ways that we typically wouldn't, because you're not always going to have all the resources you want. So if that's the case, you need to be willing to reach out to others in your organization that you might not typically work with, but there are always other people that can help out when you need them. With that, I'll hand it off to Nick.
Thanks. All right, so the second challenge was just how stealthy the attacker was. So they did a number of things to kind of counter our forensic effort on the endpoint and on the network. So on the endpoint, they would use secure deletion, this pack up and move technique. So every 3 to 4 days, whether or not we had found them or not, they would delete all their files and move on to new systems. So it constantly catching up with them, even if you hadn't done anything on those systems. And they followed this, we called it a 90% doctrine. Out of those 10 systems that had their foothold with their primary backdoor, 9 of them were very similar, all with different C2, but similar persistence mechanisms, similar details. Then they introduced one that was a little bit different. Really great idea for any of the red teamers out there to follow something similar. That way, if 9 systems are actioned, it's obvious that they didn't find that 10th way. It's a new way to introduce features as well. On the network side, and I'm heavier on the network analysis side, they use compromised legitimate infrastructure for everything. So to recap that, 1,000+ domains and IPs, all of which was compromised third-party infrastructure that they used for the attack. So every new system that's infected had its own C2. And they use social media as well. So they altered their communication scheme throughout, and they embraced SSL. So a bunch of things to make it very stealthy. The odds were also stacked against us for a couple of reasons. We were unable to use some of our technology, so some of our signatures and stuff we had going in, and the existing devices were inconsistently deployed and had some spotty coverage. And the last thing here is the rolling remediation. That's nice phrasing for like whack-a-mole. We don't typically recommend that approach, especially at this scale, but it showed our hands to the attacker. The attacker knew exactly what was working and what wasn't. So that was one of the things that had to be changed. Here's a bonus slide, a little bit more on the OPSEC, just because it's so cool. They use their mass activity to obscure maybe the real target. This has been more evident in some of the recent campaigns, where they'll use a brand new method to phish a bunch of select people across a bunch of organizations, but it's almost prioritized. So you might not be high on the priority list even if you got the phish. They'll get to you if they get to you. This is interesting because actually Matt and I, our opinion is they almost want the first system to be caught. Super creative way of phishing, and I think people share that, share the intel, and every organization feels like they've dealt with them. And a lot of organizations we've responded to, they've received this, they've gotten threat intel and have pulled a system offline and feel like, hey, we understood it. What APT29 was actually doing was, as soon as they got on, they switch out their backdoor, they get deep persistence with a couple of the methods Matt's going to talk about. And again, they almost want that first system with all the investigative leads, everything. They want it to look like it was only one system. Okay. They also conducted their data theft exclusively using legitimate US-based services. This complicates it for law enforcement and other things to follow up on it. But they use Gmail, Google Drive. They loved using the APIs and would actually download DLLs to communicate directly out to Google's API. They also used OneDrive. Here's a little screenshot. That link actually doesn't work anymore for how to do it with Microsoft. You can't really see it. For Windows 7, you can do it in Windows 10, but it's mounting OneDrive as a network share. So the attacker loved doing this and just moving data out that way. So the last little bonus piece here is just how much they monitored us. The very first system I did analysis on was the attacker taking my information for coming over on site. So they were definitely targeting our team. It was very interesting. They targeted throughout the compromise. They wanted to know if we were on to them, how it was we were finding them, and how much time they had left until we attempted to remove them again. And it was kind of a game of OPSEC on both sides, right? When it came to that last part, them wanting to know when the client would try to remediate, we tried to do things like put calendar invites for a party someone was doing, or someone's taking vacation this weekend, and thinking a lot of that out because they're monitoring all the communications and not feeling great even about some of our out-of-band stuff. It didn't work, but we tried. Okay, so what we really did is we made the most on the endpoint. So talking about the endpoint, anti-forensics. We made the most out of these trace artifacts. So they used the sysinternals sdelete tool a lot. Okay, so the file content, the file names, those are gone. Well, not so fast. You can find evidence of the use of sdelete, so some of this kind of metadata around it. So you're going to get the rolled alphabeticals, overwriting the file name and stuff like that. But so that's something you can search for. Well, the entry modified timestamp for those files typically indicates when the sdelete occurred. Okay, so now you can look for at scale when sdelete is occurring. It also is helpful. It's something we've used at Mandiant for a while, that anytime you use a sysinternals tool, you actually get a registry key created for accepting the end user license agreement. So now tool by tool, you can look for it. So we looked for new uses of sdelete. So we started to target that way. And then when you get onto that system, assuming it had prefetch, some of their operations, like so the prefetch accessed files for RAR, you could actually see a list of what the files were called at that time. So there's some really creative ways to piece it together. APT29 then deleted all the prefetch files once they figured that out. And fun fact, on some of the cases we're responding to right now, it's all built into their backdoor. So none of those sdelete artifacts really matter. Their secure deletion is in their backdoor. We do have a real-time trigger-based way of finding them that is actually firing anytime there's a file rewrite on the system, and we write triggers for that. But we didn't have that at this time. Okay. Next thing we did is we made the best of what we had. Remember I said we couldn't use some of our tech and had this kind of spotty coverage and all that. We learned and leveraged those client tools. It's a little bit different than what we normally do, but we embraced the differing technology across different business units. It actually presented an opportunity to detect, the attacker probably didn't know what was between these different business units. We actually didn't either. We would kind of just blindly search. We got it all centrally into a SIM and we're able to search. But it was more likely that we actually might have something that triggers on a piece of the activity. So then, we'd search, anytime there's a new system, we search everything that happened for that system around the time frame of activity in the SIM, regardless of what was there. And then we search between infected hosts to see if there was communication. That's key here in a second. We just automated that where possible. If we had something that worked, automate it, build a dashboard, make it easy. Okay, I want to give these two quick examples and some context we actually haven't given before on these. It's kind of two examples. The first one was from an appliance that I think like an IBM ISS appliance that is certainly not next gen, but it did a really nice job. It wasn't tuned. It was very noisy, but we were able to filter out and find really cool things in there. So while we couldn't pull traffic, we couldn't pull PCAP from there, you can reconstruct like the first packet. So that's not great, but the alerts on it were awesome. So it actually had an alert for the SMB transfer of UPX packed executables. All right, anyone who looks at some of this traffic, that's going to be super noisy. There's tons of stuff that uses UPX and pushes around all over the network. So printer software, for instance, is constantly pushed around by admins. But then we were able to extract the fields that we wanted. Again, in this case, we used Splunk. Isolating out the file names that it went to, start to build things, and what you see, or you don't see, unless you're in like the first row, is that a little excerpt where there's these files were written over SMB and they were UPX packed. So the first is actually a printer software, and then SMB writes to the Adobe ARM directory and Microsoft Office directory. So those turned out being CDaddy. But all of a sudden we build up this visibility. Now this next one is kind of crazy. So as we were trying to prioritize and triage systems, we had to make judgment calls for how much time you spend everywhere. There's a couple of these systems we kept getting to that all we saw in it was that a scheduled task ran and that a batch script was executed. That was it. We took kind of a bunch of different analysis techniques to try to look through it and reconstruct different timelines. Just couldn't get anything there. So we prioritized those lower, but we saw a couple of those being done, and that made us nervous. Once we expanded our network visibility, and we were doing that thing where we searched between two hosts for just everything, we started to see a lot of these MSRPC suspicious encryption events. Those were occurring a lot. Again, another kind of untuned appliance. But it turns out that's there's one UUID specifically that's associated with the command line task scheduler that is used in Windows 7 and up. It's the contents are encrypted on the wire, but we at least now were able to identify when someone was scheduling tasks remotely if it crossed some of these appliances. So that was cool visibility on the network side. Well, when we started to look for that, we saw it corresponded with one other event for those systems. That was SMB writes to system 32. So what was actually going on was the attacker was pushing their file, overwriting legitimate Windows binaries, which is pretty crazy, and then using that batch script to double timestamp, so we weren't able to find it on the with host forensics. And that's actually how we found Hammer Toss. If people saw that kind of cool video that's been put out, we've never really mentioned that before. But the really cool lesson for us was that these network time kind of preserves the original time when the host-based time stuff is stomped. Okay, so making the best of what we had, then we also made some shiny new stuff, deployed open source tech where possible to fill out the gaps, and found ways to apply our methodology to this. So we have kind of this incident tracking process we follow. We threw all that into Splunk and enriched it there. One of my favorite things was the use of spark lines, because with so much information going on during a breach, this allowed us to not only see the time but volume of activity. Let me show you what was actually going on here. So this was yet another way to find them. This was a network signature we wrote for Python-initiated SSL connections. So we filter for outbound Python-initiated SSL connection. We filter for a couple more things. And we have this. So you go hosts 1 through 10, they're compromised with CDaddy, Python-based backdoor, and it beacons out. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and you see each of those initial blips. That's actually the initial beacon. From a host perspective, if we're running sweeps and scans and see something, the most interesting system is probably host 10. This is the most recently compromised system. That's where we're going to go look. Well, they compromised 10, then they went back somewhere in the middle, and they started to go to work. And that's where you see the traffic there. That's actually every time they were interacting with it, it fired the very granular signature we wrote. So that's where they were doing some of their data theft, using some of their other utilities. Then we just started prioritizing our host analysis based on this. So we were able to recover these tools that they were otherwise S-deleting, and we just kind of smashed and grabbed everything. The lesson here is to improve visibility, don't stop looking. You want to minimize those blind spots based on what the attacker is doing. Give people access to tools they wouldn't normally have. Here we gave network analysts access to the host side, host analysts access to the network side. That was key. And then the lesson I said about the network time was really cool. Combat IR fatigue. This was super tiresome. As interesting as it is in the presentation, 8 months worth of it is grueling. When if you lose track of them, you're in trouble. So automate where you can. Try to keep people from doing boring stuff. And once the attacker's found, you're going to fight to maintain line of sight. So that brings us to the third challenge. They're rapidly evolving tactics. So they actually use 7 distinct backdoors here. Some of those I don't think have names or are public. One of them, CDaddy, was the one they were using a lot, so I hit on it a couple times in the presentation. It went through 3 major version revisions. I'll show you in a second. But they use 7 persistence mechanisms. Registry run keys, link file persistence, persistent services, WMI, Matt's going to talk about that. Name scheduled tasks, they hijacked existing name scheduled tasks too, which was pretty cool. And then they overwrote legitimate files, like I said. So overwriting a number of files that will launch a number of different ways on a system is really kind of the ultimate persistence, the ultimate way to blend in. Okay, so, and they cycled those techniques kind of regularly. I realized that we say 7 backdoors, 7 persistence mechanisms. Everything was interchanged. Also, they didn't really reuse a lot of this metadata that people commonly track and share as threat intel. I see a lot of APT29 threat intel, and there's some good stuff there that's tactic based. But in this case, at least, they don't really reuse file names, as we said before, really anything else about it. Everything was different, and the C2 was unique to each. Okay. They also didn't need to reuse compromised accounts. One of the things we do is we track compromised account usage for reasons Matt will describe. That didn't matter at all. So that's what we were facing. So what we did in response was to maintain eye contact with the attacker. So I said there was 3 versions of CDaddy. Again, I really apologize for those in the back. I don't know how else to present it. All credit to APT29 here. This is only looking at the cookie field, not even looking at the data that's shared back and forth. But just want to show you how much it would change to evade being found. At first, version 1, this is PHP sesh ID, and it's just a cookie value. At the center was JSON-based C2. Then it used AES encryption, then zlib and base64. Okay. The frustrating, we could see it, we knew it when we saw it, we wrote signatures for it, and we were able to decode it. To decode it, you had to actually recover the private key, the AES key of each system, but you could retroactively go back and understand what was happening. Sweet. Okay, that changed. Version 2, they did a couple things. They dynamically generated the cookie name, no big deal. Custom base64 library, no big deal. Here's the crazy one. They injected the use of an RC4 cipher as well. We never saw them share the key. So what we had to do was brute force it, and we believe, our opinion is that on their side, that's just how they built the backdoor to do it. They had the computing power to brute force on their end as well. So yeah, so it wasn't a super long key, and there's little tricks, like because it's JSON at the bottom, and it's a block cipher, you only need to decode to get the brackets for the JSON. Like there's shortcuts, and we tried to do some of that, which was pretty cool. But we lost the ability to decode it, needless to say. At 10 or more systems per day, it's not valuable to try to do that kind of crypto. For version 3, we lost the ability to sig it. This still frustrates me to this day, trying to write the signatures for it. So all they did was add a random split in it. But by randomly splitting up this stuff, just based on all its other features, it introduced so much other noise. So putting rand functions in your C2 is frustrating when you're doing all these other things. Okay, but we knew it when we saw it. Well, that went away. The last piece is they wrapped it in SSL, so we couldn't see it at first. Okay, sorry, this is very iterative, but with Bro that we used when we deployed open source software, you get a lot of this cool metadata. So the point is, like, don't give up on this. Yes, it's in SSL, but the SSL has a lot of metadata here. So the X509 certs have stuff like the cipher that's used, and if the attacker would slip up and leave some default configuration settings, you could start to see that. So, the first and the third one were the attacker, the others weren't. You just had to get over the system. As long as we get on the endpoint side, we'll be okay. So I do want to also add that then they started kind of veiling and unveiling things with SSL. So if you want to make a change to the backdoor, start using a lot of SSL, make modifications, then stop using SSL. So pretty creative. We kind of hit on this, but we prioritized the unknown. We spent time analyzing those systems where we knew the attacker accessed it, but we didn't know what they did. Once we finished the one on the batch script that was hammer toss, there was a couple like that, really sneaky, stealthy things that were being done. So to limit what we were looking at, how do you do that? That's where that data comes back into play, where it's not useful as an indicator, but it's useful to help prioritize systems. So any kind of common forensic artifact we could tie together, although it wasn't reusable, we had file size for every malware, all the traits we'd break out and had in a spreadsheet just to keep track of it, right? But then we were able to get a couple wins. There's a pseudo random file that's dropped that's associated with the C2. So if you recover that on another system, you already know the C2. You don't have to do reverse engineering on the sample. There's tricks. One of the crazier ones was because they were compromising legitimate websites, two systems were blood donor websites, two different blood donor websites that were compromised and used as C2. So I think we loosened it up. We said, okay, let's look at all network traffic to anything with blood in the domain. It's ridiculous. Found two new systems that way that were both using different blood donor-based websites. So gives you an idea of how much we're kind of just fighting to keep up. Okay. The very last thing I want to talk about is, continuing to improve our indicators. So we created indicators for every stage of the life cycle. At the end, we had indicators for all 7 persistence mechanisms. These methodology-based indicators are kind of core to what we do, behavioral type indicators. So we'd find the systems without known malware. Our Flare team's awesome, the reverse engineers. So they do a deep dive on all the major revisions. We basically just triage and keep looking. We maintained a list of high confidence indicators to focus on where we need to be. So we've had 7 ways of finding CDaddy, and we kept that on a list, not on a computer. That's important because after one weekend, we came back and we only had 1 way of finding them. So they had changed enough things to evade 6 of the, literally the different indicators. structured that we had searched for them for. At the end of the day, what was working was these flexible and resilient indicators, providing high fidelity matching, even that was resilient to anything they'd be able to change under the hood. As long as it's still a Python-based backdoor that you're wrapping with stuff, unless you want to make a new backdoor, right? There's going to be things that stand out. Size ranges, section names, compile times, stuff like that. Things that you can change, but that are a little bit harder to do. So, okay, there, see? That's CDaddy. Everyone knows that, right? That's a picture of it. This is a representation of how layered their malware was, and then what we did at each step. So down at the bottom, we have obfuscated Python wrapped with either PyInstaller or Py.exe to compile it on Windows. Then a little bit hard to see, sorry, just UPX packed and pushed over SMB. Hit on some of that before, but okay, going down to the middle, we automated we wrote some decoders for these configs so that we were just to speed things up, and then you look to repurpose that. Okay, now we can look for what these configs look like with these search terms in process memory enterprise-wide. That was cool. We focused a lot on these indicators for the packaging and delivery of the malware. So it turns out when you run it with PyInstaller to Py.exe with default settings, you're going to get 1 of 2 compile times. Okay, great. If you UPX pack it with default settings, you're going to get section names of UPX0, UPX1. Okay, these are things that we build up and that we worked on the file system side. The key was changing those and adapting them to look anywhere else because they were cleaning up so much. So looking in process handles, prefetch, event logs, anything like that. The real lesson here for the rapidly evolving tactics is just to rapidly evolve, yourself. Find it, refine it, refine it. The toughest thing I think for us was the first one here, to enhance your best indicators even when they're working. So the tendency is to say, yes, that was awesome. Like as soon as you have something awesome, that's where you need to go back and think, well, what else could we have in case something changed, and keep working. And track what they can change before you lose it. Don't let that technical data fall between the cracks. There is some other utility for using it, certainly when it comes time to writing that lovely report about what happened. So back to Matt to talk about the real cool stuff.
So the last thing we're going to talk about is some of the advanced attack techniques that they were using. This is stuff that we were aware of, had done research on, but at the time, this stuff wasn't as common or as fashionable as it is now. A lot of this stuff is kind of taken off. And the first of these is Windows management instrumentation. I'm sure everyone's familiar with WMI now. This is an administrative framework that's been built into Windows since the 90s. A lot of flexibility, a lot of power. Really has become fashionable in the last couple of years. So the attackers used WMI pretty extensively. They used it to persist backdoors, which this was actually the first time we'd ever encountered that in the wild. We'd released some papers on it, but it was cool to actually see it. Embedded backdoor files and PowerShell scripts right in the WMI repository. So this is a file that sits on disk. It contains all of that WMI administrative data. There's all kinds of cool stuff in there. So if you haven't looked at that file, if you do IR, look at it. But then by putting all their data in there, it created essentially like a fileless solution. If you didn't know to look in that file, you're not going to find it. They used WMI to steal credentials from remote systems and to kick off processes on remote systems, so they didn't have to use PsExec or schedule tasks or any of those things that people look for. They're able to do it very discreetly just right over WMI. And they even configured it to extract and execute backdoors months in the future in order to try to evade our remediation efforts. They also leveraged PowerShell. I would hope everyone here knows what PowerShell is by this point. This is kind of the PowerShell conference. I'm not going to get too much into that, but they used it for stealthy backdoors. Really for every stage of the attack lifecycle. The attackers really love PowerShell for all of their post-exploitation, so I guess Jeffrey Snover would be pleased. They used scripts like invoke Mimikatz, which at least at the time were evading AV detection very effectively, and had excellent WMI integration, so this is really what they were using to back all of those WMI attacks. And then Kerberos. Kerberos, obviously the authentication protocol used in all modern Windows domains. They used a lot of Kerberos ticket attacks, which really made things a lot more difficult on us, and we'll dig into that in a minute. So the first thing we're going to talk about is WMI usage. So the first thing we had to deal with was persistence. This is the first thing we really saw them using it for. This started out basically with us identifying activity by other means and then getting onto the box and trying to figure out, okay, where's the persistence, and essentially pulling up the objects.data file, which is the main data repository from that SIM repo, and then just looking through it, looking for evidence of the persistence contained within this, 50 to 100 meg file. not easy, not scaling very well. We eventually got to a point where we're running a script across the environment to look for this, but that's also not great. It's authenticating all over the place. It's pulling data back slowly, kind of kludgy. Thankfully, some of our colleagues developed a custom audit for our tool set that allowed us to look for this at scale. And that was a huge benefit for us because all of a sudden we're actually finding this really effectively. And since WMI persistence is very rarely used for anything legitimate, I've only seen like 2 legitimate WMI persistence incidents in my entire career. So pretty good way to find attacker activity. We also identified evidence of attacker code in the WMI repo. So they were using a really cool script, and I probably should have broken this out in here because it is actually pretty fun. They had a PowerShell script that would connect to a remote system over WMI. They would they would create a WMI class, which is basically just what you think it is, and 2 properties for that class, which are just like text fields. Into the first one, they would write the contents of the invoke Mimikatz script. Then they would send over a command to run PowerShell and to execute the contents of that property in PowerShell, which would then run invoke Mimikatz. And then they would write the output from that into the other property, also stored in the WMI repository. And then they would read this from the remote system, and then they would delete the class, which, at least in theory, should just wipe all of this away. But what's great is the WMI repo kind of has like a slack space. It doesn't like resize the file all the time. So when you delete things, they kind of sit there for a bit until they get overwritten. So we're able to find systems where they've done this, pull out some indicators from it, and then look at the contents of these objects.data files at scale across the enterprise and find systems that they'd access this way. And they did some other things with embedding things in WMI as well, which we also had to kind of address there. But really just being able to look at this at scale was a big benefit. We also had to parse out embedded scripts in malware. So we found instances where they would create these properties and start writing 3.5 megabyte executable files into them, base64 encoded, or scripts, or whatever. And we had to find ways to pull this out. And this is kind of non-trivial. This is a very large file, and over a certain size, it will automatically chop this file up into pieces and write it at different offsets throughout the file. And if you don't have a parser for this, which didn't exist at the time, it's very difficult to pull these pieces back together, get them into the right order, and get them to work properly, especially when they started using a lot of encryption, so that if you didn't get all the pieces or didn't have them associated right, you were pretty much out of luck. So we were able to do that. We kind of just worked at it. Thankfully, Willie, Matt, and Claudio did some great work reverse engineering this repository and made parsers for it. Willie's in particular is awesome. It's Python-based, and it will fully parse out this repository, so you can get to every class, every property, every piece of data that's in there, you can just parse right out. There's even a little GUI for it. It's fantastic. It would have saved us a ton of time. Unfortunately, they didn't release until we were done. So, oh well. So this is an example of the kind of strings we were looking for, especially at the beginning. You can see at the top there's an event filter. Essentially, this determines when is something going to happen. And this is a pretty classic, like at startup kind of consumer, filter. Then at the bottom, you see the command line consumer. This is basically what's going to happen. So in this case, it's going to run that logon UI.exe, which was just a CDaddy backdoor sitting on disk. This isn't the most complicated thing. And then in the middle, you see there's a filter to consumer binding, which basically pairs these 2 things. So next thing we'll talk about is PowerShell. So the attacker used PowerShell for basically everything. It was their favorite way to operate. When we got there, pretty much everything had PowerShell 2.0 on it. PowerShell 2.0 logs just enough to let you know that something happened in PowerShell, and basically nothing else, provides no real context. We were able to upgrade the environment to PowerShell 3 and enable module logging. The logging's a whole lot better now with PowerShell versions 4 and 5, but even 3 provided a ton of really valuable information. It captured input and output, variable initialization, entire functions of PS scripts, attacker commands, script output, all kinds of stuff. We're able to identify basically every stage of their attack lifecycle using this. So we could see, and we wrote indicators that we were able to look at scale for any time that they moved laterally, their unique backdoors, credential theft, data theft, recon, persistence creation. I mean, they were doing things like, for most of their data theft, they would use a PowerShell script paired with a legitimate Exchange DLL to pull data from their Exchange server from just any arbitrary host. So they would run this, specify an account, specify do they want, the inbox sent items, deleted items, and then just pull all of that stuff down to the system. But this resulted in them writing out all of these individual files for every email. And so we would see the names of all of these emails, even after they were deleted. They were just recorded right there in the log. So we threw together a quick parser, and then we now have a list of stolen emails that we can hand to the client and be like, here you go, this is what they took. So, I mean, that level of visibility into their activity was just fantastic. And also being able to look for this at scale really turned their usage of PowerShell from a threat to a benefit. They went from having an extremely powerful tool set that gives them really nice arbitrary code execution without having an executable on the system to basically we have a transcript of everything they're doing. We do have a blog post up that kind of defines some of that logging and some of that details as well. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. And if you don't have PowerShell logging, I would definitely encourage you to consider getting that enabled. So this is an example of what a module log entry looks like. So you can see there's the command path, which will show actually which script ran, which here it's C Windows temp diag3.ps1. And then down below you see the actual output that this was trying to write out to the console, which would have been the actual output from Mimikatz. If you're familiar with it at all, you'll recognize it. And this particular instance, they're using a Kerberos pass the ticket attack with file 1.krb. So this is them authenticating to a remote system using a Kerberos ticket attack. So Kerberos ticket attacks are particularly annoying because they do a few things that really kind of throw a wrench in a traditional IR process. The first is that when you generate these tickets, you're actually submitting a forged ticket. Once you get the KRB TGT password hash, you can actually sign these tickets yourself. And so you can basically define whatever you want in these tickets and then sign it, and the remote system will accept it as valid. So you can just go around authenticating to systems as Batman if you want with full administrator privileges, and there's literally nothing that's going to stop you. Instead of doing that, what the attacker did in this instance is they enumerated everything in Active Directory, which is like the first thing they do. They come in, they enumerate your entire AD, and then just steal it. And so they would either randomly select an account, or they would select an account that's associated with the machine that they were logging onto and use that account, but they would give an unprivileged account full domain admin privileges. So they're logging on using what looks like a legitimate account, but now all of a sudden it has domain admin. And in some environments, this might not be so bad. If you have a finite number of admins, that could work. But this environment was so large and there were so many admins, the client couldn't even give us a list of who was actually a legitimate admin. So it's always kind of, guess and check. So we started out basically looking for other evidence of attackers accessing these systems, and then kind of backtracking and finding evidence of these Kerberos logons and figuring out where they came from. Oh, the other thing I failed to mention is that when you do this, when you do a Mimikatz pass the ticket attack in order to authenticate to a remote system, it doesn't generate an explicit logon event. So when we do IR, typically if we see an attacker access a remote system, we get these explicit logon events. We can see what account they used, what system they accessed, and we can just kind of follow this trail down the line. With this, that event is never generated. So you can tell when you see that in the logs that they authenticated somewhere, but there is no real way to tell where unless you have like very minute level NetFlow or some other kind of indicator which we didn't have available to us. So we could backtrack. We could find systems that were compromised, figure out where they came from, and kind of walk back up that compromise chain, but you couldn't walk it out the way most IR teams would do. So yeah, we really had to just keep looking at the endpoints, get that visibility at scale, find evidence, look at those, track it back. Eventually, we did develop some indicators based on research of Sean Metcalf at adsecurity.org. If you do IR or forensics and you don't frequent that site, you should change that and frequent that site. He does some fantastic work there. He developed that research late in the investigation, but it was extremely high fidelity, and I'm forever grateful that he did that because I did not have the time to do that in the middle of this investigation. So that worked out really well. Here are some of the kinds of indicators we were looking for at the time. So in a Windows 7 system, you won't see the FQDN of the domain in a 4624 event. So, I mean, this is kind of trace stuff, right? Like the empty account domain in the 4672 and 4634 events. Really trace items, but really valuable as indicators. Unfortunately, all of these things have since been patched. So none of this works anymore. I guess this is, what happens when people do good work and disclose indicators. Everything gets patched. So there are no good endpoint indicators for Kerberos ticket attacks that are currently disclosed. So good luck. So bonus slide. even more WMI and PowerShell. So this was a particularly interesting one that kind of pulled all three of these things together. So the attacker authenticated to this system using a Kerberos ticket attack. They went in and used a PowerShell system on the source system that they logged on from, ran this script, and it created this WMI persistence. This one's a little different from the one we saw before. It's set to run on the first, second, fourth, fifth, and sixth days of the week at 12:23. And this thing will run this encoded command block. And so when we dug into this, we found that there was a bunch of like crypto contained in this block, but the really relevant part was this, which essentially is going through and it's defining a WMI class and property, and it's grabbing that value, it's decrypting it using AES and another function I didn't include, and then it's executing it. So now when we go back and look and pull out that rack task, hive upload task property, grab the value of that, which, as I mentioned earlier, took quite a while and was actually pretty difficult to get that data out of the repo. We found that it was a backdoor sitting there that actually used a domain generation algorithm and would reach out and pull down an additional file from its C2 and run that in memory. So a really sneaky backdoor. I've seen this referenced recently in something about the DNC, but so they're obviously, they've been using it. They use this a lot. This is one of their favorite kind of sneaky, persistent backdoors. I don't know how much they'll be using it now that it's kind of, their spot's been kind of blown up on that one. Also interesting is there are a number of these backdoors that we saw the attacker actually test before deploying. So that was one of the really interesting things to know, that a lot of the things they were doing here were things that they were coming up just to mess with us. As opposed to things that they already had kind of hanging out in their arsenal, because we'd see early versions of stuff that they just kind of like drop and run. So we saw like a PowerShell script just sitting on disk that they kind of dropped and run just to, I guess, kind of see if it would work in a live environment. And then they kind of tweaked it and refined it, and then they started deploying it actually in the WMI repository. And we saw that with a few of the different tools here, that they were actually going through that testing cycle on our network while we were trying to respond to it. So the lesson from this is to use attackers' strengths against them. These really kind of advanced, stealthy, crazy attacks can make for really good indicators, because there's not a lot of activity on your environment that's going to look like this. So if you can find it at scale and get that visibility, you can really take advantage of this to scope out that incident and to get a really good perspective on what the attacker's doing. And then I threw this in just because I think it's cool. It doesn't really fit in anywhere, but the attacker, 3 hours before we were supposed to go into remediation, so we were talking about how we tried to trick them. It obviously didn't work, because they dropped this thing on 3 or 4 systems, like literally 3 hours before the internet got cut off. So it was a backdoor that utilized Tor hidden services. So this is the same sort of thing you'd see on the Silk Road or something like that. But instead of redirecting, and basically this results in port redirection, right? So traffic comes in from Tor, it hits certain ports, those ports get redirected to typically like the 8443, like all your web server ports. But instead of doing that, what they did was redirected it to remote desktop, NetBIOS, and SMB, all of your remote access ports. They also updated the registry to enable RDP, and they did the sticky keys, exploit, if it's really an exploit, so that they could get unauthenticated privileged console access when they RDP in. They RDP in, they get to that front page, which shouldn't even be an option anymore, but backwards compatibility is apparently paramount. And then they just, hit the button and up pops their system level prompt. And then they can go in and create new accounts, do whatever they need to do to get back in after we do a password reset. So what is Meek, and why are they using this Meek plugin? What is this for? Well, if you're going to run Tor off of an endpoint, that's going to be pretty noisy. It's very distinct traffic and very easy to SIG. So the Tor project released this plugin called Meek, which is pretty cool the way it works. So this is actually the config from that Tor server. So you can see that they hid it under program files x86, Google/data. So they renamed everything to look like Google Update, kind of things, just trying to be discreet. And you can see here down at the bottom the hidden service ports redirecting. And there was also a secondary configuration that had the actual host, the hidden Tor hidden service host name and password and all of that information as well. So Meek goes through after it runs through. And you see here in the middle, client transport plugin Meek, right? So URL meekreflect.appspot.com, front is google.com. Essentially what this does is on the endpoint, The data will come through from the server. It will go through the Meek plugin. The Meek plugin will take it, wrap it in SSL that looks like it's destined for google.com. It will send that connection out, establish that connection with a google.com server using the legit google.com SSL, going to a legit google.com IP. This exploits kind of a trick of the way that a lot of these clouds work, like Google's Cloud, Cloudflare, a couple other providers, where essentially if you send something to one of their servers, if it ends up at the wrong server, the server will automatically redirect it anywhere else in that cloud. So what it's doing here is it gets to google.com. Google.com strips off the SSL and notices that the HTTP header actually says meekreflector.appspot.com. And because Google bought AppSpot, it's in the Google Cloud now. So that traffic gets redirected to meekreflector.appspot.com. Meekreflector then takes that traffic, reassembles it into Tor traffic out of those HTTP packets, and dumps it out onto the Tor network. And then the Tor network, goes over to APT29 sitting there on the other endpoint. So then from a network perspective, what you see is a connection from a desktop to google.com using google.com SSL at a google.com IP. How cool is that? Yeah, I'd say also, Nick brings up a good point. We've never actually discussed this anywhere, so you are the first people ever to see this outside of our company. So, cool. So if you learn nothing else today, you really have to meet or exceed your attacker's pace, their visibility, their development cycle, their advanced techniques, and ultimately you have to meet or exceed their intensity. You have to be willing to commit and really put the work in to overcome them, with an attacker like this that has the resources that they have, that can take a lot of effort. And with that, we will take any questions. We have a couple minutes. Calendar time was 6 to 8 months. I mean, we were there for 8 months in total, but some of that was post-remediation monitoring. A lot of that time frame was driven by basically how much time they needed to prepare their remediation steps. So we gave them a pretty extensive list of things they needed to do to try to end this, and it took them quite a while to be able to prep all of that. I don't think we ever disclose contract dollar amounts.
Four people. This is not too bad given what we're up against.
Yep.
How were you able to positively identify that the bad guy was APT29?
So, I mean, we have an entire Intel group which is made up of all kinds of people who have done fun things in interesting places. So they're the ones that actually do the official attribution. So basically, we had seen a lot of their tools, their TTPs before. We had, good confirmation based on the particular phishing campaign. Like APT29 doesn't try that hard not to be attributed. They really don't. They don't seem to really care because I think they realized we were not going to really do anything about it. So yeah, I mean the attribution on this was apparently fairly straightforward.
And yeah, there was not really a lot of other activity from other groups. We were kind of pretty familiar with them, so we recognized immediately when it was them. There wasn't a lot of other activity, which was surprising here given the length of it. We normally run into historical evidence or other things going on, but it was all the same group. Plus, when you see what data they're targeting, when you have that visibility, that makes it a lot more high confidence. Yeah.
How does the bidder analysis play a part in your investigation? And did it play a big role? What kind of automation did you do?
Yeah, we tried to, I think I talked about on some of ours, we're trying to apply anything on the file system to anywhere else we could to capture it while it was running. So actually some of the times before they were doing, one of the things they would do is they would actually just delete their backdoor from disk, figuring like they don't care to persist. So that screws up a lot of the ways we were finding it. So then you need to find it in memory. So we just applied our regular techniques. We did collect memory dumps and did some volatility stuff. I'm not good enough at it, and it didn't scale. But it's definitely another option to pursue these guys that way.
Down the middle.
C2s were all unique call-outs. Everything they're doing that way. Did they ever find any pattern between it, like the same registrar or anything, or did it end up like it was a botnet where they own these 20,000 bots and they would just did it randomly, or what? Did they ever find anything?
So they were legit web servers, and as I understand it, they were going around hitting the same exploit essentially on all of them. So they were just scanning the internet, finding a vulnerable site, hitting it, owning it, and then using it as C2, and then they just burn it. They'd never use it again.
So then your only indicators would be look for WordPress version, whatever, and maybe if you had single say.
Yep. And then it was SSL
yeah.
to the compromised websites too, so you couldn't even really look for what was going on in the traffic.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not like a magic solution to that one, unfortunately.
I was wondering, retro, if you guys found anything today.
Not really, unfortunately.
We've responded on the infrastructure side a couple times, and this is not a lot. They adapt as much on that side when they set it up as well. Yeah.
You talk about how like the rolling remediation didn't work. Can you talk a little bit more about why that didn't work? What were they doing to say?
You want to say the successful part? Why
Sure.
Part of why we were successful. Yeah.
Essentially, it didn't work because there were just too many systems and too many different ways for them to persist. So they were constantly coming out with new backdoors, and they were basically tricking the client organization with that. So they would miss backdoors, they would miss different crazy persistence mechanisms, and they just wouldn't be able to do it. Not to mention, it's hard to catch up when there's so many compromised systems all the time, and you have to know your full scope and if you're really going to be able to remediate. One of the things we did that was successful was we got them to stop pulling systems offline that had the sneakier backdoors. So they kept pulling the main backdoor, but at least with the stealthier stuff, they stopped. And we think that contributed to success because it made the attacker at least kind of complacent that they had 3 or 4 different sneaky backdoors in place that we couldn't have found all of them.
And then you shake them all.
Yeah, so we cut the internet, pull everything off at once, do our remediation steps, password changes, and then pull it back up and monitor.
How long did it take you? How long was the internet down for that process?
3 days. And it's a very, very large environment. And the client had a lot of remediation steps in order to try to respond to this. So that's why it took that long. We try to keep it as short as possible. And we're out of time, but we'll be around.